Raise your hands. How many of you here today were not born into Unitarian Universalism? We who have our hands up are far from alone. There's no exact figure for how many of us came from other faith traditions or from none, but I've heard estimates as high as 80% across the denomination. Happily, it looks like that percentage is lowering, at least in this congregation. We've welcomed not only new members with children young enough to effectively be native-born UUs, but some of the children from our early years are now themselves parents, bringing their own kids here to UUCSH. Children born into the faith are taught a basic truth, which those of us who just rose our hands had to discover on our own. A little background. I was raised Catholic, and overall it was actually a good experience. None of the horrors that so many other Catholic children went through were ever inflicted upon me. I feel comfortable in Catholic church buildings, and to this day, I miss the majestic high ritual and pageantry surrounding the church's major holidays and ceremonies. As I alluded to before in our affirmation, what I don't miss is the top-down imposition of not just dogmatic beliefs, but also the rules and ideologies we were expected to embrace just because the church said so. Over 1 billion Catholics around the world do as the church tells them and have perfectly fine spiritual lives in so doing. As with so many other revealed religions, the laity rely on the clergy, divinely summoned to be God's intermediaries, to figure out the tough stuff. Back in the 1960s, Catholic children made their first communion at age 6 or 7 when they were in first grade, spending Sunday school that year in preparation. During my first grade year, my undiagnosed ADHD was enough of a problem that I was pulled out of class and taught by my parents under a priest's supervision. It's sort of like reverse homeschooling or something. I'm not sure how that works, and I was there. Since I didn't go through the rehearsals the other kids did, my actual first communion was a little clumsy. The week after that, I did everything correctly, but I was still worried enough about it that I didn't think about the actual sacrament. Third time was a charm. Getting in line, my heart wasn't racing, my palms weren't sweating, unlike right now. And when I got to the front, I said and did all the right things at the right times and went back to my pew feeling like I'd finally mastered it. The communion rite is not over when you get back to your pew. You don't just sit and wait for everyone behind you to finish. During that time, you kneel and enter a prayerful state. That was new for me. There had only ever been sitting at the dinner table or kneeling next to my bed or attending Mass, repeating the same words yet again, still not knowing what all of them meant. What was fruit of thy womb, Jesus, anyway? Underwear? I don't know. A prayerful state meant talking to God freely, more like conversation than the strict scripts of prayers in the Mass. As I knelt, I wondered, I can do that? I'm allowed? A few seconds passed, enough time for that thought to get to God, and for him to react. Nothing bad happened, so clearly the answer to that question was yes. God responded, I believed, by putting another question into my head. This works with everyone else doing the same thing at the same time in a zillion churches? Again, clearly yes, or what I was experiencing at that very moment would not be happening. As I contemplated that, I realized that I had no idea what my dad, kneeling beside me, might have been talking about with God at the same time. let alone any conversation between God and the stranger on the other side of me. Were these three telepathic lines ever even connected to the same thing? And what about the other two religions that I knew of, Protestant and Jewish? Who did those people talk to? All I could think was that God was a zillion things all at once, different for every person, but we still needed churches because there was so much more to it than just me and him. Does that sound familiar? That few minutes of exploring spirituality, of seeking the truth and freedom, stuck with me. At the time, Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Boonton didn't have much for kids who didn't also go to Catholic school there. So every Sunday, we went to Mass, then we went straight home, because there was nothing like coffee hour either. The summer after 6th grade, we moved to Bloomington, Minnesota. It was a 2-minute walk from our house to the Catholic community of St. Bonaventure. And I don't have this in here, but it reminded me of something else. There have been a few things in my life that have happened that I, to this day, will never be able to explain. One of them was when my parents came home from the house hunting trip that they had gone to in Minnesota. They told us they had found a house, and it was near what would be our church. And I instantly knew that it was St. Bonaventure. I do not know how I knew that. I never will. Anyway, it was a 2-minute walk from our house to the Catholic community of St. Bonaventure, but St. Bonnie's was a universe away from Mount Carmel. It became as much a part of my life then as UUCSH is for me now, because there was so much going on there outside of Mass. There was as much as there is here outside of services. I had such a good time there that I couldn't face what was becoming a larger and larger problem. As I mentioned before, the Catholic Church imposes hard limits as to just how much truth you can seek and in just how much freedom. And I had hit those limits. I loved that parish, but I could no longer ignore that when I recited the Nicene Creed, I was lying in church to God. When I left Bloomington after high school, I never sought out the Catholic churches in the places I lived. For most of my young adulthood, my religious practice had been reduced to what I would later see described nicely in AA's 11th step. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Working the 11th step is entirely an individual activity. Doing so, unknowingly before getting sober, then knowingly afterward, I learned or discovered a lot of new ways to communicate with what the Catholic God might have been had he not been constrained by church doctrine every bit as much as I had been. But doing that just by myself was hollow. AA had its own constraints regarding spiritual exploration, framing everything in terms of the God of the Abrahamic religions. I needed people who were on the same spiritual journey that I was on. I won't go into how Alcoholics Anonymous led me to Unitarian Universalism. That's a long enough story that I could do a whole nother service on it. But when I got here and asked that same question I had asked 30 years earlier while kneeling after receiving my third communion, how do I know that the God of my understanding is the same as the God of your understanding? Instead of a stern talking to by a priest worried about the state of my soul, the people here said, "You don't." And neither do we. Except for us, that's not a problem. It's the defining aspect of this entire religion. In our congregation's early years, Reverend Craig Hirschberg's opening words included the phrase, "a free and honest search for individual religious authenticity within a supportive community." School didn't expect me to get educated all on my own. AA didn't expect me to get sober all on my own. And while this community gave me the incredibly difficult assignment of finding my authentic God in whatever form or in no form, you don't expect me to do that all on my own either. I can't thank you all enough for that. Let us, all of us, continue to explore spirituality, then come together here to make sense of what we make.